Hello, everybody. So, somewhat in contrast to the film that we watched last week, John Sayles' The Brother from Another Planet shows us a Harlem that is very firmly in decline. Its glory days really the subject of nostalgia. And without a lot of kind of the romantic, visually striking elements of Barry Jenkins's film. As Walter says in one of the scenes in Odell's bar, Harlem was the place, the end of the line. But whereas that phrase, the end of the line, formally referred to the destination of a person escaping slavery or Jim Crow, for some of the residents depicted in this film, it may be more like a dead end. Once the home to a raucous nightclub scene, Harlem's entertainment industry is now personified by an aging singer past her prime who performs for a nearly empty room. Nevertheless, Sales's film is a bittersweet comedy, showing us how people continue to find happiness and social support in a blighted urban landscape. So, as I indicated last week, this sense that Harlem had kind of been left behind had been building for quite a long time. Conditions were already pretty bad in the 1920s, and by the 1980s, things had really sort of reached the bottom, had sort of reached their very lowest point. In his chapter on the post-civil rights era in Harlem, Jim Garrison tells a story of how, even in 1970, Bishop William L. Bonner of Harlem's Greater Refuge Temple asked a group of uptown ministers to plead with their congregants, many of whom drove to the city only on Saturday mornings, to come back to Harlem the rest of the week, too. The Negro Mecca, the capital of Black America, the cradle of the Negro Renaissance, a key node in the civil rights movement, now needed to beg its residents to return. Unrest and urban renewal had reduced the population to half of what it was in the 1920s. Those who remained were used to hard times, but they were unprepared for the unemployment, crime, drugs, corruption, deteriorating schools and housing, simultaneous overcrowding, and further population loss that would make the Depression seem mild. So, in the previous lecture, I talked very, very briefly about some of these factors that contributed to the slumification of Harlem in the middle of the 20th century, including customary forms of discrimination that had kept residents out of elite professions and out of unions, plus housing policies that led to significant overcrowding in the Black neighborhoods in New York City. But the truth is that there were many more factors even than this. The Great Depression, of course, did considerable damage, turning Harlem into what Garrison calls a black ghetto, 80% of whose businesses were owned by whites. Some also look to the riot of 1943, which resulted in the destruction of apartments and businesses that simply never returned. And we are actually going to see this in the very end of the novel. So we'll talk about it more in a couple of weeks. Scholar Kevin Mattson also posits a political theory that the rise of consumer culture in the United States pacified the populace and sapped Harlem of the radical energy that could have brought about change. Garrison, on the other hand, actually suggests the opposite reading, that the dead ends of communism and Black nationalism, and that will be the subject of next week's lecture, offered short term psychological benefits, but few significant long term returns in terms of material conditions uptown. There were also broader macroeconomic forces at work. In the post war period, Harlem was victim to the same trends that were reshaping many American towns and cities, specifically the decline of manufacturing jobs and the growth of the service economy, which was dominated by lower paying, non union jobs. So between 1952 and 1965, New York City lost almost 90,000 jobs in manufacturing. And cruelly, these well paying, protected jobs were disappearing just as reforms were enabling Black people to enter them for the very first time. So, you really did in the 1970s and the 1980s have a growth of opportunities for African Americans as the result, again, of non-discrimination laws in both employment and in housing, but those opportunities were disappearing even as they were becoming available, a really sort of bitter irony of the last half of the 20th century. On top of that, efforts to ameliorate the horrible living conditions in Harlem by raising the old tenements and building new public housing actually had the paradoxical effect of forcing many of the old residents to uproot themselves. So, if there was a very dilapidated and even dangerous building, the city might come in and say, "We are just going to tear this building to the ground." But there were people living in it. And so they had to leave and did not always get to move into the new buildings that were built in their place. So we saw the results of that in unrest in Moscow just a few years ago. And this is precisely what was happening in Harlem during the 1970s. And what that meant is that these communities that had made Harlem socially and economically vibrant were, in many cases, irrevocably displaced. Those residents and businesses moved to the outer boroughs or moved to New Jersey or even other parts of the United States. And finally, in the 1970s, facing a fiscal crisis caused by a recession, inflation, and a dwindling tax base. Because of all of this, the city of New York began cutting services, which included laying off 14% of the police force and over 15,000 teachers. So Harlem was already having a problem with crime and already had severely under-resourced schools. And these cuts simply made things worse. Um, Harlem experienced unemployment rates as high as 40% during this period. And with the reduction in police and the loss of employment opportunities and the generally, deplorable state of Harlem schools, crime soared, which caused, again, more depopulation as residents continued to flee to other parts of the region or even back to the South. One further contributing factor, which is a significant focus of this film, was the drug trade. The Brother from Another Planet was actually made before the infamous epidemic of crack cocaine, which caused drug related medical emergencies and fatalities to soar in 1985 and 1986. So, in the years just after this film. But Harlem had already long been home to a thriving heroin business, which is what we're seeing in this film. We can also see, like, the fact that this is in some ways a film that comes just a little bit before the big concern over AIDS, over HIV and AIDS. Um, so this is, having to do with the heroin trade. In 1968, a longtime criminal named Frank Lucas took over the Harlem empire of a guy named Bumpy Johnson. These guys tend to have colorful names. And Lucas's innovation was in importing heroin from Vietnam, smuggled actually in the coffins of dead servicemen from the Vietnam War. And this allowed him to circumvent the Italian mafia and brought immense quantities of a new, pure form of the drug called blue magic heroin into the city. By the early 1970s, one third of the heroin addicts in the United States lived in Harlem. And in the 1980s, much of Harlem would, in the words of Garrison, resemble an active war zone as gangs took over territory and vied for dominance. By the 80s, Harlem was subject to not only the drug violence, but also to chronic neglect. It was a national symbol of urban decay and just no longer a subject of economic, political, or artistic interest. During my teenage years in the 90s, Harlem was spoken of by both Black and white people alike as a kind of dystopia, as a kind of cautionary tale, as a thing that you were warned about. So, all of this makes this film, with its comedic elements and happy ending, something of a revelation, something of a bright spot. In the early 2000s, Martin Scorsese would lament the lack of modern films set in Harlem. But The Brother from Another Planet was a notable exception to this trend. John Sayles made this film for roughly $350,000, a very, very low budget for a feature film. And most of it was self-financed, meaning he had a great degree of creative independence in the creation of this film. And he wrote it as a kind of tribute to Harlem and to these residents of Harlem during this part of the city's very darkest period. And despite its science fiction premise, Sayles said that what he wanted to do was to get beyond the stereotypes and horror stories about the neighborhood and to represent daily life in Harlem as it was lived by normal people at that particular time. He says that People and even some of the black people in the crew had never been to Harlem, and they had been warned against it from their parents or whatever. There's that imaginary Harlem that's iconic, and there's that everyday people go to work, people go to school Harlem, and the tension between the two of those is some of what the movie was about. So the film is structured as a series of vignettes or small episodes linked together only by a very basic plot. And it depicts people going about their lives, all of it viewed through the eyes of this visitor from another planet. And by the way, if this photo of John Sayles looks familiar, it's because he cast himself as one of the men in black. The guy on the left is John Sayles, one of the slave catchers who is looking for the brother. We can talk in our online discussion about whether or not we think that's significant at all. So, this device of making the central character an alien allows Sales to explore several themes. For one, the story is a modern twist on the runaway slave narrative, which has long been a major part of the American literary canon. It also makes this an immigrant story, an important but largely forgotten part of Harlem history. And finally, the fact that we are seeing Harlem through the eyes of an alien enables the filmmaker to defamiliarize many common points of reference, like Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. Sales says he doesn't know what these things mean, yet for the audience, it's, oh, he's coming in through Ellis Island, like so many other immigrants, and there's the Statue of Liberty, and all these kind of iconic things that we think of as coming to America. He has no idea what they are, so you know there's always that thing of whose eyes you are seeing the world through. There are two tracks of what the audience's preconceptions are and what they already know. And what I eventually want to do is get them to see the world through his eyes. So, very shortly after he comes to shore, even though we know what these things are, he doesn't. So, we see the world through his eyes. And seeing things like he sees the crucifix in the window and he thinks, wow, this is a tough planet. Step out of line and they nail you to a board. And because the brother looks like he absolutely belongs in Harlem, except for his feet, which he covers up most of the time, the locals respond to him like he's one of their own. They reveal things about to him because he isn't quite a stranger, even though he really is just about as strange as you can get. And that raises something that I kind of wanted to talk about. In the last two films we've watched, we haven't talked a great deal about the impact of actors on storytelling. But I think we kind of assume that the director is in charge of everything and that the actors are simply told what to do. But Joe Morton's performance here as the brother provides some opportunities to think about the way an actor shapes our perception of a character. He has no lines to speak, so the performance is entirely pantomime. And though it's almost certain that he and Sales collaborated in the development of the character, one topic we might explore in the online discussion is the way that Joe Morton uses things like gestures and reactions. He has a very, very expressive face to make the brother plausible as an alien passing for human and reacting to all these very new things he sees. I just want to say in conclusion that Sales's triumphant ending, predicting better days for both the brother and for Harlem, can be taken unironically. Conditions are much better in Harlem today and in New York City as a whole than they were in 1984 or any time previous. This is in part due to a nationwide decline in crime rates over the 1990s and the 2000s. And that's a phenomenon that social scientists are still trying to understand. There was a big decline over those 2 decades in national crime rates and crime rates in cities, but we don't exactly know why. There are lots of theories, but not a lot of firm conclusions. But like Moscow, Manhattan is a much safer place than it was 20 years ago, and therefore a more attractive place for professionals. And so, as demand for real estate in the city has increased and the cost of land and living space has risen ever higher, it became inevitable that both apartment hunters and developers would begin looking to Harlem for opportunities. And thus, we can say that Harlem in 2021 is undergoing a period of gentrification. Indeed, while the neighborhood remains predominantly Black and Hispanic, the number of white people living in Harlem nearly doubled between 2000 and 2010. The effects of this are really complex. While this renewed interest in uptown real estate has brought much needed investment, one of the impacts of gentrification is to displace some original residents who are either forced out as part of those slum clearance efforts that we talked about earlier, that result in the demolition or renovation of entire buildings, or simply because rents and property taxes in the area become unaffordable. So, while bringing many desirable benefits, gentrification doesn't fix the problem of inequality. There are several directions that our online discussion could take. I have really been enjoying the scene analyses that you have been contributing in our last two film discussions. So if you want to kind of continue that, then that would be great. However, I'm also going to propose a few other topics in the thread that may also be interesting, including the differences between the urban experience portrayed in this film and the one in Beale Street, as well as some of the choices made by the filmmaker and principal actor.